I just found this very interesting article. This is from the Bridgeton Pioneer, June 4th, 1891. And let's scroll in here. And the story is called The Electric Well, a story of Yankee genius and English capital. A number of eminently solid-looking sons of Great Britain were assembled one morning in an office in Thames Street, London, listening to the remarks of a tall, heavy man, evidently an American. "I repeat it, gentlemen," he was saying, "the company which I represent has absolute control of the grandest discovery made in America, that land of wonders. You have heard of the natural gas which springs up in such unlimited quantities and with such enormous power, and you know how far-seeing men secured the right to utilize this gas before its great commercial value was properly appreciated by the masses. If you've followed the careers of those adventurous spirits, you have learned how they became wealthy beyond their wildest dreams and how a market sprung up for natural gas even greater than the production of wells. Again, you see all around you the multiplied uses to which electricity is being put. All that steam can do as a motive power, electricity can accomplish. All that petroleum has furnished for light and fuel, electricity can supply. Who at the present day dare affirm that electricity has reached its limits as an agent for the promotion of man's physical welfare, or who dare deny that the day will come when this unknown fluid will form our sole power to the exclusion of all other forces? On the other hand, you realize how seriously the introduction of electricity for power and illumination is retarded by the expensive machinery and still more expensive patent rights and royalties for which every consumer must pay. Such being the case, gentlemen, and bearing in mind the adaptation of natural gas to commercial uses, what I say to you, the discovery of what I may call natural electricity, the tapping of unlimited and unmeasurable quantities of power, fuel, light, what you please, and the utilization of vast force which will cost but a trifle at the beginning and not a penny for patent rights or royalties? Well, you may look astounded, for the idea is stupendous. But this, gentlemen, is my mission tonight, to offer you a clear title to the only wells of natural electricity in the world. The speaker paused, and immediately his audience, filled with enthusiasm at the idea, jumped to their feet. "Wonderful! Magnificent!" they shouted in chorus. The American waited until the ebullition of feeling had subsided, and then continued. "I am not here to ask you to purchase a pig in a poke. On the other hand, we request and insist that before any deal is closed, our plant and our rights be thoroughly investigated by a representative chosen by yourselves. Should this exert decide our discovery is not as well claimed, we will cheerfully pay all expenses incurred and release you from any obligation to purchase it. If, on the other hand, our property is as represented, we ask that upon receipt of information to that effect from your agent, you pay us the sum of £10,000 and receive in turn full title and ownership of the most valuable discovery in the world." The speaker took a seat. Bedlam immediately broke loose, and when order was last restored, the temporary chairman announced that every share of the American Electric Well Company Limited had been subscribed for, and that until a permanent organization could be formed, Sir William Gull had consented to act as chairman, and that further, Honorary James Noblin had been deputed to visit the States and inspect the property which it was intended to purchase. After a caution from the American to preserve the utmost secrecy, the meeting broke up, each participant hurrying homeward, his brain filled with golden visions. 3 weeks later, James Noblin stepped out onto the shores of the United States and was immediately accosted by a jolly, rotund gentleman who, when satisfied he had dressed himself the proper person, introduced himself as Thomas Tapton, the resident manager of the Penn Natural Electric Company. Bubbling over with good fellowship and hospitality, he took James Noblin in charge and accompanied him to the best hotel in New York. "Not a word about the business yet," he cautioned the charmed recipient. Then followed a flying journey to Chicago on the magnificent Limited Express. Mr. Noblin was dazzled by the wealth of the country and overwhelmed with the pleasures showered upon him. His daily letters to the syndicate were filled with glowing descriptions of the resources and commerce of the states, and he frequently wrote that if the property of the electric company proved to be as claimed, the value of the discovery would be incalculable. At last, his guide led him to the natural gas belt, taking directly to Finlay. What the Britishers saw here bewildered him. Gas everywhere, used for every purpose, and while almost as free as air or water, yet clearly a bonanza to private owners of wells. Now, suggested Tapton, after witnessing the wonders of natural gas with its miles and miles of extensive trenches and tubing, try to grasp the idea of natural electricity, so clean and so cheaply applied to every art and purpose. The listener could only nod his head in appreciation. From Finlay, the pair went to Pittsburgh, and James Noblin was taken through the great iron mills, where natural gas was the only fuel. Wonderful, miraculous, were the words constantly upon his lips. Now to business, remarked Mr. Tapton. As they started eastward, within 24 hours you will be brought into the presence of a natural power, before which natural gas pales into insignificance. That night they stopped into a hustling mining town in the interior of Pennsylvania. Early next morning, Mr. Tapton secured a conveyance and drove his companion out along a wild and lonely mountain road. Now, before going further, remarked Mr. Tapton, allow me to state that one of the most valuable properties of natural electricity lies in the fact that we are not compelled to use a return wire to complete the circuit, as in the case of the manufactured fluid. You, of course, are aware that telegraph and telephone companies use only a single wire, completing the circuit by means of the ground connection. But on account of the great quantity of electricity wasted when the force of the current is brought up to a point available for illumination or for motor purposes, it has been found necessary to resort to return wires, thereby incurring double expense for lines. Our method is exactly the reverse of the telegraphic arrangement. Getting our electricity from the ground, we complete the circuit with an air connection, or in other words, run a wire to the top of the house similar to a lightning rod. You will notice this apparatus is wired in that manner, and those connections were carefully pointed out. Mr. Tapton then proceeded to demonstrate the practical workings of the plant. Taking the usual precautions of linemen in handling live wires, he connected an arc lamp with one of the loose lines. Instantly, the light flared up with a hissing sound. Another arc lamp was connected until all were shining and dazzling brilliantly. Yet another wire was connected with a little machine Mr. Tapton termed a reducer, and at once all of the incandescent lights made a soft radiance from their bulbs. "What do you think of that?" queried Mr. Tapton. The representative of the British syndicate could only shake his head in amusement. The manager now busied himself in adjusting a belt connecting the motor with a line of overhead shafting, which was in turn connected with the machinery. Affixing a single wire from one of the tubes to the motor, he turned on the current, and the wheels began to revolve. Little by little, pressure was added until the full force of the current was on. One by one, the sewing machines and presses were brought into action until all were humming merrily. Seating himself beside his guest, the manager talked about the details of the work and how it was expected a machine that being constructed would carry electricity into stores and dwellings and therefore transform it into heat. A specimen of peculiarly insulated wire was then produced, which he stated would carry a 500 miles without the slightest loss of force. "Now, Mr. Noblin," he continued, "I will give you an overwhelming proof of the genuineness of our discovery. As you see here is a hollow tube, an ordinary piece of pipe, running down 300 feet to the top of the cavern whose floor furnishes this mysterious current. To the end of this coil of insulated wire I will fasten this attractor, and with your aid will measure off enough wire to reach the bottom." The Englishman lent a hand, and when the requisite length had been unreeled and cut off, one end was connected with the motor from which the other wire had been removed, and the loose end was placed in the tube. The weight of the wire soon caused it to descend rapidly, and finally, when the entire length had been paid out, the motor began to move. By the degrees, the current was added and the machines connected until all were revolving as before. The Englishman expressed his entire satisfaction with the test, and as the morning had worn away, the manager closed the current and led the way to the carriage, stopping in the yard to call his companion's attention to the new well being drilled. "We propose to give you conclusive evidence," he added, "that our representations are based upon facts." When the pair returned to the hotel, the Englishman lost no time in cabling home that everything seemed as claimed. Every day for a week, the pair made daily trips to the house. As the new well was drilled through to the cavern, and after it had been lined, a test was made with loose wire. The result was highly gratifying, the force being fully equal to the power of other wells. The day the British cabled home a single word, "except," and the next morning, at a meeting of the syndicate, £10,000 were paid to the Penn Natural Electric Company, which in turn transferred full title to the property. 10 days later, Noblin stood at the dock and welcomed the chairman and the board of directors who had come over to inspect the property. Mr. Noblin gingerly connected a wire with one of the lamps, the result being awaited with breathless interest. Nothing followed. He looked surprised and tried another connection. The result was the same. "I fancy I don't quite understand it," he murmured. The members of the syndicate became a trifle nervous. Mr. Noblin was desperately working at the tubes when someone spied a letter lying on the shelf addressed to the American Well Electric Company. It was handed to Sir William Gull, who opened it, but he had read a half a dozen lines before he turned pale, gasped, and nearly toppled over. Recovering, he read aloud, "Gentlemen, I regret exceedingly to be compelled to inform you that the current from the wells has ceased, due no doubt to the fact that the sheriff has levied upon and removed the engine and dynamo at the mouth of the Big Bird colliery which furnished the power. The cavern and other workings of the collier are still beneath you, however. I trust you can utilize them in developing your purchase." So this story was a scam. It was a story about a man who gets scammed into believing that this atmospheric electricity exists, but in reality, the power had came from a dynamo in the coal caves. But is there any truth to this story? I mean, we have to look and say, well, is this all a fantasy, or is there actually more to this? Because a lot of times these kind of stories have a little bit of truth.